We have been discussing the American dream, particularly as it relates to this time period in American literature, modernism. Today we're going to talk about the American dream and how it relates or doesn't relate to Richard Wright, the author of the novel that we're going to be reading, Black Boy, that was written during this time period in American literature. Now, the American dream was the premise that anything is possible. In fact, settlers and immigrants came or come to America during this time period to the U.S. to find freedom, prosperity, and happiness because, of course, other cultures, other countries, they were looking at America as if they were the new Eden, the place where anything was possible and things were plentiful. For most, again, that belief was that the American dream was attainable. But if we think realistically about America and what's happening in this time period in American history in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, we know that the American dream is not possible for everyone, particularly the African American Black population. So to review, what is the American dream? Remember, it is the premise that America is the new Eden. It's the new promised land of beauty and unlimited resources and endless opportunities. And after we move out of the Civil War and we get through Reconstruction, people are believing that, not just the people in other countries, but the people in America. And in other words, America is the land of plenty, and any individual can prosper in America if they work hard. Another tenet of the American dream is that the independent, self-reliant individual will triumph, and everything is possible for the person who places trust in his or own powers and potential. And we saw this belief in Emerson's works, where he stated that if the individual worked hard and trusted in himself, he could do and be anything. So it's that idea coming back to play, that romanticism idea that we lost during the realism time period that is now coming back. Another tenet of the American dream is that progress is a good thing, and we can optimistically expect life to keep getting better and better. And America during this time period in particular was constantly getting better and better with more inventions and social reforms, and everything was in a person's reach, or hypothetically, everything was within a person's reach. But in reality, the American dream was broken during this time period for a significant portion of the American population. And so let's take a look at what that means. Again, the prospect of obtaining the American dream was broken by World War I, which resulted in destruction on a scale never seen before, and the Great Depression that followed, the 1929 crash of the New York Stock Exchange. So while the American dream was not technically existing for a large portion of the American population, even after World War I and the Great Depression, the American dream was broken for a significant portion, not just the African American Black population, but for those populations that fell in the lower socioeconomic status in the American culture. So the average American suffered as a result of these events, and the pursuit of the American dream was only for a select few. So let's talk a little bit specifically about modernism, that literature that was being written during this time period. This term refers to the bold and new experimental styles and forms that swept the arts, and that includes literature, music, film, and what have you, during the first part of the 20th century. Modernism reflects a shift from traditional values and beliefs, including the belief that the American dream was possible. So again, we move out of realism and we're moving into this time period that seemed like it was going to be prosperous, but then things broke, either through again, World War I or the Great Depression, or again, looking at those marginalized culture groups really that never had access to the American dream. And the literature of this time period reflects that. So some characteristics of modern literature include that the authors and poets began experimenting with new techniques in their writing styles. Richard Wright, who is the author of the book that we're going to be reading, incorporates a mixture of episodes and sensory language in his novel, and this is new. So we've got a mixture of storytelling, but also sensory, poetic kind of language. In the works that are being written during this time period, we have a new kind of hero who is flawed and disillusioned, yet honorable and dangerous. So, works maybe in the Romantic period had heroes that were true heroes. They were larger than life. They did great things. During the realism time period, we really didn't have heroes. The works were about the ordinary average Joe. During this time period, the heroes in our short stories and in our books are heroes in a sense that sometimes they do good things, but we also see the round side of them. Some of their flawed characteristics shows through. And we're going to see that in the book that we're reading because Richard Wright, who is the protagonist of this autobiography, is inherently a good person, but at times he does a lot of stupid things. And another characteristic of this literature during this time period is more literature is about all Americans, not just the white American population. We're starting to get Black literature that is not solely about slavery. We have lots of new voices. In fact, we have some Black authors, we have some female authors, we even have some immigrant authors during this time period. And so we start to have new voices and new experiences in the literature during this time period. So this chart that you see here on your screen kind of breaks down a comparison between the literature of the time periods that we have recently been looking at, Romanticism, Realism, and now the modern or Modernism. So note that Romanticism typically emphasized imagination and emotion. Realism emphasized accuracy and objectivity in their storylines. And now the Modernism time period is going to emphasize a strong disillusionment with tradition and what was or what used to be. So we're going to see a pessimistic view in the literature that we really haven't seen up to this point. Continuing down the chart, Romanticism typically depicted larger-than-life heroes, whereas Realism depicted common, everyday Joe kind of heroes. And the modern literature is going to depict people existing and dealing with life, and they're no longer clear heroes. Like, we're going to have some protagonists that do some good things, but they're also going to be flawed, they're going to make mistakes, they're going to be real, they're going to be raw. And that's going to be our protagonist in the novel that we're going to read. Moving down the chart, Romanticism typically viewed the world poetically. If we think about Emerson and Thoreau and their writing, it was very beautiful. It was focused on nature. It's very sensory driven. Realism viewed the world scientifically, objectively. Here's what happened. Here's how it happened. Not a lot of flowery language. And then we move to the modern time period. And the literature during this time period is going to view the world psychologically and socially and culturally. We start to get more of the internal thoughts of our characters. We see a lot more first-person points of view and perspective. And so we're starting to learn from the narrators what the characters are thinking. We haven't really seen that in fictional writing up until this point. And then finally, for Romanticism, that literature tend to focus on exotic, supernatural, and ordinary worlds. Think back to Poe's writings. And then in Realism, the literature focused on real-life situations, realistic things. And then modern literature, again, is going to focus on new voices, unexplored traditions, different themes, and different types of characters that we haven't seen. This is really the flowering of fictional writing in American literature. So let's talk a little bit more about the novel specifically. It is entitled Black Boy. It is an autobiography, and it's written by Richard Wright. The quote that you see here on your screen, "I want my life to count for something," is a famous quote by Richard Wright. He went through a lot of trials and tribulations to be able to become a writer and to have his writing published. And so this particular quote speaks volumes for what he went through and why he accomplished what he accomplished. So Black Boy, the novel, exemplifies the loss of the American dream. It is told from the first-person perspective. Wright is a young Black man growing up in the South, and he wasn't privy to the American dream. In other words, he never had access to the American dream. And we see that primarily through most of the novel. Continuing on, Richard Wright was born in 1908 in Roxy, Mississippi. And so that's deep South. This is during the Jim Crow laws. There's segregation. And so this is not necessarily a novel about racism per se. And we do see that in the novel, but this is more of a novel written by a young Black man telling about his experience living in the Black South. And he really didn't have a lot of interaction with white people until we get deep into the novel. So this is more of a socioeconomic type of novel where he's talking about what it's like to live in poverty and to live in that type of cultural environment. He did, again, grow up in the South during the age of the Jim Crow laws. He was the son of an illiterate sharecropper, and so the adults in his family were not well learned, which made it challenging for a young black man who wanted to learn, who wanted to read, who wanted to write. Imagine growing up in a household where the adults typically didn't read and write, and how hard that is for a young man to be able to foster that desire to want to be able to do so when the adults in his family don't value that. He was one of the first African-American writers to achieve literary fame and fortune. And so that's one of the reasons that we read this novel, not to mention the fact that it's just excellently written. Black Boy is Wright's autobiographical novel, so all the content in it is considered to be true and accurate. It is generally considered creative nonfiction in the sense that he wrote it as an adult, so reflecting back on his childhood and actual dialogues and things like that. He's pulling from his 3-year-old, 4-year-old memory and what that might be like. So sometimes we just have to take that as it is. Now, in this novel, he creates a voice in the narrative. He uses lots of sensory details and he builds characters to convey his personal experience. So when I say he creates a voice, it's almost like we hear him telling us that story. And as we begin to read the novel, you will totally get that vibe and that feeling for what that means. So Richard Wright's writing style is deceptively simple. Readers tend to focus on the drama and the plot and the detail, and sometimes they are unconscious of the multi-layered character development in the novel. So we will have a lot of activities that kind of get us back into considering the character development and how the young narrator reveals to us what the people in his life are actually like. Readers are typically attuned to the intense emotional suffering of the characters, and Wright seeks to expose the racial stereotypes and destroys them. And so as we move through the novel and Richard's growing up, we do start to see those racial stereotypes that would be prevalent in the South. But that is not the beginning focus of it. In this novel, his heroes tend to lack direction, and society denies them the opportunity to acquire it. So he does encounter several people along the way that have inspired him or do inspire him to write and to continue to, forge through getting out of that lower class socioeconomic culture that he's in. But it's still difficult for even them during this time period. So continuing, I'm going to provide to you some pictures or paintings that might help you kind of reflect what life was like for Richard during this time period, just to, get into that vibe of what his setting in his cultural atmosphere would be like. And so here are some images of what the areas that he grew up in might be like. And so reflect on the housing and the dwellings that you see here. Of course, the women during this time period would have been iconic in their families, and oftentimes they would have been the heads of the households. If the men had to go out and work, they would be the ones that would be rearing or guiding the children. We are starting to see more developed white communities, and during this time period, most of the black females would be working in the white communities as maids and nannies and things like that. And so you see a huge disparity between the previous photos and the one that you see here. And then there would have been some social communities, bars, stores, and things of that nature that Richard would have visited. This is that iconic image that displays the segregation, how things were separated for the blacks and the whites during this time period as well. So as we move into our reading of the novel, we are going to discuss Richard's personal reflections and experiences, the trials and tribulations that he goes throughout the novel. And we're going to be taking a look at the deep character development that he presents in the novel from his first-person perspective, and how the setting and all the conflicts that go into play kind of inform Richard's experiences until he becomes the great novelist that we know him to be today.